I go straight away, please, to Professor Dermot Keogh, Emeritus Professor of History and Emeritus Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration Studies, UCC, who will speak on the Constitution and the development of Irish society since 1937. And Dermot will hopefully manage to confine his contribution to about 15 minutes.
Thank you. I certainly will. And thank you for inviting me to speak on this historic occasion. Now, in teaching Irish history for over 30 years, I've been struck by the lack of familiarity many students have had with the text of the Constitution. And I don't think that the primary reason for this is that it was not available to them. I think instead that it had more to do with the perception of a document that was drafted in De Valera's Ireland, and secondly, a document which has enjoyed a very negative press in recent years. Indeed, popular criticism of the Constitution is often ahistorical and innocent of an informed understanding of the context and circumstances in which the document was drafted. Archives on the drafting process have been available since the opening of the De Valera papers in 1987, yet in 1996 one historian could write that much of the new constitution had been drafted mainly by Jesuits and other clerical advisors, unquote. This thesis that the Irish Constitution was the product of episcopal and clerical machinations has a popular currency in contemporary Ireland. But that caricature, as Justice Hogan has pointed out, does a great disservice to the independent-mindedness of the small team of civil servants who guided the document through its drafting phases. While there were advantages to having a small group of trusted senior civil servants working in secret, it meant that various interest groups in society remained outside the process. Labour, farmers, and the professions, etc. Groups representing the interests of women were not consulted, and strong criticism was levelled at the draft document when published from that quarter. The drafting process belonged, in other words, to a period of closed government, and the idea that participation in a process of this kind was not the norm or a feature of democracy of Ireland in the 1930s. On the 1st of July 1937, the same day as a general election, the new constitution received the approval of a majority of the voters. And between 1937 and the mid-1960s, the Constitution was embedded successfully, seeing the country through the Second World War with 2 amendments and then 2 defeated amendments in 1959 and 1968. I think the newly created office of President came to symbolize the popular embodiment of the Constitution. And the opposition in the Dáil had, during the debates, spoken eloquently about the dangers of such an institution, thinking possibly that De Valera might become another Salazar, Franco, or Mussolini. But the way in which the Constitution, or at least was formed, and the manner in which the office was filled from Douglas Hyde through to De Valera indicated that it was not in any sense a threat to democracy, quite the reverse. And I think today the office of the presidency has grown in preeminence, and it would be very foolhardy, and a very foolhardy person who would now argue for its abolition. In August 1969, the 3 political parties in Dáil Éireann agreed to set up an informal committee to review the Constitution. It was a timely, if somewhat overdue, decision. Irish society had changed radically since the 1930s. There had been heavy engagement and a strong movement to Irish cities in the 50s. Efforts were being made to modernise the country. Protectionism had been jettisoned in favour of a policy seeking membership of the EEC. Literary and film censorship was relaxed. Access to second and third level education was opening up. But there was still a bulwark of conservatism which treated change as being very dangerous. And the Constitutional Committee's report in December 1967 was a very interesting one and a very enlightened one. And I want to single out just one of the recommendations, which was not fulfilled at that particular time, to illustrate the lack of progress on constitutional reform. The Constitutional Committee suggested that in the directive social principles of the Constitution, a much neglected section of the Constitution, they sought to include the phrase establishing the principle of equal pay for men and women for work of equal value. That was when the committee reported. And that recommendation or principle, acceptance of that principle, had to be imposed under pressure from Brussels and only came into force in 1977. So the Constitutional Committee was unlucky in the timing of its report because national politics in the latter part of the 1960s and the early 70s were defined by the drive to negotiate Ireland's entry into the EEC, the outbreak of conflict in Northern Ireland, unprecedented turmoil within the Irish government, and finally the need to break and to bring about social and constitutional change. This came fairly far down the list. However, while ambitions for widespread constitutional reform were subsumed by efforts to deal with the contingent economic, political and security challenges, there were demands, at least in certain areas, coming from the top, from Jack Lynch, the Taoiseach, to reform the Constitution, particularly in the area of Article 44. And that article was reformed. The special position of the Catholic Church and the recognition of the named religious denominations were removed on the 5th of January 1973. I think the Taoiseach Jack Lynch had, like De Valera in 1937, engaged in consultation with the leaders of the different churches in advance. He secured consensus for his proposal, and I think the process showed the importance of dialogue and consultation, rational discussion and patience when trying to, in a sense, bring about constitutional change. In August 1979, the Lynch government successfully put the 6th and 7th Amendments to the people on adoption, and the second providing for the election of members of Seanad Éireann by universities and other institutions of higher education. Now, I think membership of the European Economic Community accelerated the pace of social change in Ireland in the 70s. And here I just want to single out, as I have done, the forward thinking of Jack Lynch, also the thinking of Dr. Garrett Fitzgerald, because in or out of government, he served as an important fulcrum for change. And as Minister for Foreign Affairs, he had a good platform to advance his views on pluralism, making strong arguments for change to individual Irish bishops and the Holy See. He did not receive a sympathetic hearing from either party. Perhaps he was naive, and he was, in my view, very far-sighted, however, and the battle to change social legislation and the Constitution in the late 70s and 80s might have been more amicably and less destructive than had his ideas been viewed more sympathetically. The 8th Amendment, acknowledging the right to life of the unborn, with due regard to the equal right to life of the mother, was passed in October 1983. And the government files on the background to this amendment are not yet released, but when available, they will make instructive reading for legislators and academics alike. Because, as a working hypothesis, I would argue that this amendment marked a watershed in Irish history. At no time in my life have I witnessed deeper and more entrenched divisions in Irish society. There are many lessons to be winnowed from that whole experience. The working of the New Ireland Forum in 83 and 84 was a template of how, in a sense, one could advance discussion in an amicable and friendly way. The process served and serves as a model. Submissions had to be detailed from the different interest groups. Cross-examination followed of the different delegations, serving as a good antidote to the stridency of the 1983 referendum campaign. Forensic cross-examination discouraged shooting from the hip. And despite the growing diversity of Irish society in the 1980s and the radical polarisation of that society, constitutional reform was piecemeal and sprung out of urgent need for action. But it was on occasions very fraught, very confrontational, and moved away from the kind of model of consensus that can be achieved through sort of extensive dialogue. A dialogue that this convention will, I hope, engage in. As the debate continued into the 80s over constitutional reform, tens of thousands of young Irish emigrants left the country and made their lives abroad. Today they are well organised and would be a valuable voice to be heard in future debate on constitutional change. The arrival of the new Irish from the 1990s has helped create a vibrant, multicultural and diverse society. The work of the Forum for Peace and Reconciliation in the 1990s, which preceded the Good Friday Agreement, revealed how dialogue and cooperation could lay the foundation for lasting peace. And that peace dialogue also prepared Irish society to deal in a more constructive way with the challenges of diversity. In seeking to adopt the Irish Constitution in 2012, the Convention is fortunate, I think, to have sort of as a basis for its work the Herculean efforts of the Constitutional Review Group chaired by Dr. Kenneth Whitaker, which reported in 2008. But I think these are very difficult times, the times in which you're meeting. The economic boom, which attracted so many immigrants, gave way to bust in the early 21st century. Almost all the major pillars of our society have suffered a collapse and left a huge credibility gap in the wake of scandals, lamentable judgment, and low ethical standards. I'm referring to the leadership in part within the Catholic Church, to the leadership in the banking community and the professions, to leadership at local level in politics and administration, and also to some extent at the national political level. Added to that is the growth of Euroscepticism in the 21st century, manifesting itself much earlier than the arrival of those who are funding our bailout. As Europe deepened and widened, Ireland held a number of referenda on treaty changes, the Single European Act, on Nice twice and Lisbon twice. That negativity towards the European project is or ought to be a cause for concern. And that said, you, the members of the Convention, build on a strong democratic and constitutional tradition. May your deliberations be guided by the principles of parity, esteem, of peace and of patriotism. Thank you.